Hi, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion titled Safeguarding the Rights and Wellbeing of Refugees and the Forcibly Displaced. I'm Callista, the Vice President, External Relations at the Oxford Development Consultancy. We are a student-run consultancy at the University of Oxford, providing pro bono research and consulting services to non-governmental organizations, development, and microfinance institutions. The Odc Symposium is our inaugural initiative to facilitate important conversations on international development by reaching beyond the Oxford student body. We have a 4-week program including discussion panels, talks, and networking events. We are also pleased to announce that in collaboration with the Unhcr, the ODC will be hosting an essay contest in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's an excellent opportunity for all who are interested in discussing these issues, and you will get the chance to have your work featured on Unhcr platforms. More details about the competition can be found on Facebook or LinkedIn. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Allan Rock, Matthew Saltmarsh, and Gowali Pasale. Nadia Hartman is unable to join us for the live event today, but she has kindly done a pre-recorded interview with me, which I'll be playing later. We will start with individual speaker presentations before moving into a moderated discussion where we'll take the questions from the audience. Please submit any questions that you have for our speakers in the chat. And if you wish to participate in group discussions later on, please stay after the end of the panel discussion and we'll sort you into breakout rooms. So now with all the administrative details out of the way, Allan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Callista. And I've introduced myself. Do you want me to make my presentation now or just introduce myself to start? Or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, just a brief introduction. And after all the introductions, we'll start with the presentation.
Okay. Well, my name's Allan Rock. I teach law at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Before that, I was the president of the university for 8 years. I've served as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. I spent 10 years in Canadian Parliament when I was Attorney General of Canada and Minister of Health, Minister of Industry. And before that, I was a practicing lawyer in Toronto, spent 20 years as a trial lawyer. So I bring a variety of perspectives, and I very much look forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Matthew, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Callista and Oxford Development Consultancy for inviting me and UNHCR to speak today. My name is Matthew Saltmarsh. I'm the Head of External Relations for the UN Refugee Agency in London. I've been here for about 3 years, previously worked in Geneva and in Lebanon for the agency. And before that, I worked in media and communications, including as a correspondent at the New York Times in Paris.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Gowali, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Callista. Good evening. Thanks for having us. My name is Gowali Pasale. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I lived in the UK for the last 13 years. I'm the author of a book called The Lightless Sky. So if people haven't read it, I encourage them to read it. It's a story of my life and my journey. And since graduating, I've been doing a lot of work around advocacy and campaigning for refugees' rights, trying to use my experiences and expertise to create a culture of welcome, to raise awareness, and to inform public opinion.
Thank you very much. So now we are very pleased to invite Allan to give his presentation. Allan, please.
Thanks, Callista. And I begin by thanking ODC and congratulating you on your excellent work. I also want to say what a privilege it is to share this platform with Matthew and Gowali, and that I look forward to the discussion among us about these important issues. I think we're all aware that at the moment, the world has the highest number ever recorded of forcibly displaced. And at the same time, many of us are keenly aware that the international community responds to forcible displacement in a way that is simply not fit for purpose. Determination of refugee status itself is governed by a legal instrument that is almost 70 years old. And while the Refugee Convention is of enduring value, it is outdated and insufficient for contemporary demands. The very definition of refugee no longer fits the current reality. And the Refugee Convention of 1951 speaks of cooperation among states something which is in short supply, and doesn't use the word responsibility or the word accountability at all. So instead of refugees being the collective responsibility through cooperating member states of the UN, the fact is that responsibility for receiving the forcibly displaced falls disproportionately on neighboring states. 73% of the forcibly displaced around the world are currently in states that are just across the border. They're there because they're the obvious alternative to the persecution or the hardship at home. And those host countries, the neighbors who are receiving these forcibly displaced persons, are themselves in difficult circumstances. Most of them have acute shortages of food, face malnutrition. These are countries that are in their middle or lower income category of states around the world, ill-equipped for the responsibilities that come with housing the forcibly displaced. Unlike in the distant past, displacement now is not temporary. Most displacements are for 10 or 20 years or longer. The options that the displaced theoretically have, either to make their new home in the country they find themselves in, or to be resettled in a third country, or to go back home, are increasingly illusory because of the nature of conflict, local attitudes toward refugees, and of course, the reluctance of the international community to accept and resettle refugees. The gender issue figures very large in this analysis. Over half of the displaced are women and girls, and they face peril and risks which are not well managed at present. Now, you'd think that if 73% of the forcibly displaced are in neighboring countries, that the rest of the world would at least contribute substantial sums of money to finance services for the forcibly displaced. But you'd have to think again, that is not the case. Fundraising is entirely voluntary. It's like a charity ball. You give what you want to give. Pledges are made for insufficient amounts, and too often those pledges are not even honored. So despite the noble mission of UNHCR, despite the courageous and diligent work of those at UNHCR who face these issues every day, they simply don't have the resources they need to fulfill that important mission. The global compacts on refugees and migration that we saw signed with a flourish a couple of years ago are fine as frameworks, but they don't contain any practical operational changes to address the problems that we all know are there. The World Refugee and Migration Council was created a few years ago for the purpose of directly addressing some of these challenges and working out some recommendations for practical change that will make this situation better. You'll see in the background paper that I've distributed through Callista, the council itself is a collection of remarkable individuals, 25 of them from around the world, who spent 2 years visiting refugees and the displaced where they are in the field, looking carefully at options, listening to refugees and the forcibly displaced, listening to UNHCR and those with expertise, and coming up with specific recommendations, 55 of them, for change. In the few minutes that remain to me, I'm going to touch upon the high points, just the main points of the Council's report. First of all, with respect to responsibility sharing, this should no longer be a system that depends on cooperation and voluntary contributions. There should be a legal obligation to share in the responsibility of receiving and caring for the forcibly displaced, a responsibility for all member states of the United Nations. Second, there should be accountability. Accountability in two senses. First of all, for those who cause displacement through misrule, corrupt governance, autocratic measures that create violence and conflict and force people to leave. They should be held accountable, and the Security Council should use the authority it has and stop looking after its own interests, but think about its responsibility to the rest of the world. Accountability also in the sense that those member states that are not doing their share for the responsibility for the displaced should be identified, named, and shamed, and should no longer get away with doing nothing. We make recommendations about funding for UNHCR. We say that the funding should be, the assessment should be compulsory in the UN, like it is in peacekeeping. We say that the private sector should have an increasing role in providing funding. And we say there should be an international business coalition to take advantage of the commercial and economic opportunities presented by those who are refugees. We recommend specific steps to assist host countries, including preferential tariffs and other trade measures to help their economies. We recommend that their debts should be forgiven or postponed, and that any monies that are intended to go to the country that produced the forcibly displaced through violence or misrule should be withheld and reallocated to the host states to assist them in meeting their responsibilities. And finally, we deal with the question of the internally displaced, who are really the orphans of the international system. There's no convention for internal displacement. Countries are jealous of their own sovereignty. They want to look over after those issues without international interference. They should be reminded that sovereignty includes responsibility to their own populations to look after those who are internally displaced. We recommend that the Secretary General of the UN convene a global meeting now to talk about concrete strategies for dealing with the unmet needs of the internally displaced, that there be a special representative of the Secretary General appointed to conduct surveillance on the situation affecting the internally displaced, that they should no longer be forgotten. They are by far the greatest number of displaced, much more, twice the number of refugees. It's about time that the international community meet its responsibility to ensure that they're properly and fairly dealt with. I'll stop there, Callista, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues and entertaining any questions that might come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allan. That was a great speech. Could we please invite Matthew next for his remarks?
Thank you, Callista, and thank you, Allan, for those inspiring words. It's certainly true that Canada has been somewhat of a beacon in refugee policy internationally in recent years, both in terms of resettlement, but also in terms of its asylum policy. I'm just going to quickly lay out a bit of a state of play of the situation of refugees globally, and then maybe look at some of the solutions and some of the constraints, and then pass it over. I mean, first thing to say is that, as has already been mentioned, the numbers of refugees have been rising for many years and continue to rise. Every year we put out the annual figures of refugee numbers. We're doing so again in June. The last numbers we had were at 26.5 million refugees, 46 million internally displaced, millions also of stateless people and asylum seekers. So that whole population of what we call persons of concern is around the 80 million mark and rising, with about 2/3 of the world's refugees in 5 particular situations. And as Allan mentioned, the vast majority are in developing or lower income countries. Why are those numbers rising? We're often asked, well, at a very simplistic level, we, the international community, are not very good at doing peace, if you want to call it that. We did a recent study looking at how many peace agreements had been made in recent years. This was done in 2019, and we could only find 1 in the Gambia. We've got mutating conflicts that are being driven by tribalism, by resources, by climate, by religion, by politics, by any number of different reasons. We don't have the security, I suppose, if you want to call it that, or the certainty that there used to be in the more bipolar world, when there was a Cold War and there was much more certainty about conflict. Things are much more complicated in today's world, and that has led to larger numbers of refugees. Of course, now more recently, we have the COVID situation, which is layering an emergency on top of existing emergencies. So already in the global south, we had hunger, we potentially had famine, we had problems of education, we had problems of shelter and livelihoods and water and sanitation. Now on top of that, of course, we have COVID. And COVID is also what we call a protection problem, because a number of borders across the world have been closed as a result. And of course, there's a concern that certain countries might be hiding behind COVID to keep asylum seekers out. It's not the case everywhere, but that's certainly a concern in some cases. Our latest figures suggest that 48 countries in the world are denying access to asylum on their territories, which is of course worrying. And if you look around the world, there are different concerns related to this. For example, in Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean, but in Central and Eastern Europe, we documented or noted a number of cases of pushbacks of refugees and asylum seekers. In Denmark and in the UK now, we have proposals to externalize the processing and reception of asylum seekers. At the US southern border, we now have the Title 42 measures, which are severely restricting access to asylum seekers to that territory. And then going back to COVID, of course, it's also a major socioeconomic problem. We've done a number of studies that show that refugees are being hit harder than domestic populations in terms of job losses, so loss of livelihoods and income, in terms of increased poverty, in terms of rises in rates of gender-based violence, because people are cooped up in their homes and they're unable to access services in many cases. And of course, in terms of education. Now that's across the board, but refugees in particular were disadvantaged anyway in terms of education. Obviously there are refugee situations and concerns across the globe, but most recently we've been particularly concerned about the situation in the Sahel, in Central and Western Africa, where the number of internally displaced has recently gone through the 2 million mark. This is a situation where you've got climate combining with internal displacement, political instability, mixed migration movements. And if you just look at one country in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, the level of internal displacement there is now about 6 or 7% of the entire population. So you can realize the magnitude of the problem there. And of course, it's not getting the coverage that other situations do. In terms of Europe, of course, we still have the mixed migration movements. The crossing of the Mediterranean still continues despite COVID, perhaps at slightly lower levels. And we still have people trying to cross the land borders in the east. There have been changes in the movements, a little bit of a shift towards the Canaries and coming in from North Africa. But still that remains a big concern. And of course, the conditions in Libya are particularly concerning there. As Allan mentioned, although we have new situations, we also have the protracted situations. We estimate that something like 77% of refugees are in protracted displacement. We define this as being for more than 5 years. And you've got countries like Afghanistan, which have been in conflict or certainly heightened instability for 4 decades. Yemen recently marked its 6th anniversary of conflict. Syria recently marked the 10-year anniversary, and solutions to these situations are simply not forthcoming at the moment. There are returns in some cases, but they're usually quite limited, and quite often people have to go back to their country of asylum. In terms of solutions, as I mentioned, returns has been particularly difficult in recent years. The numbers have been much lower than they were in the 1990s, for example. The 1990s, as I mentioned, did see some significant returns, particularly in Africa, in countries like Mozambique. but also in the former Yugoslavia states, because there was a sort of defined end to conflict, but the numbers are much, much lower now. One of the other solutions that we look to for refugees is local integration, and that can be quite problematic as well. Certain countries did show a very good example here. For example, countries in Africa like Uganda, Ethiopia before the latest conflict, Djibouti, Kenya. But often this is very difficult because local populations are not receptive to refugees, because there is rising xenophobia in a number of cases. And of course, in some senses, that is understandable, because you're talking about countries that have their own development problems and their own high levels of problems. There was one very positive example recently, which was Colombia, which you may have noticed gave temporary protection, although it's 10 years, so it's a very good temporary protection to 1.7 million Venezuelan displaced people. So that was a positive example. In terms of solutions, Allan mentioned the Global Compact on Refugees, and this was an attempt by UNHCR and partners and governments to try to bring different actors together, to try to look at the problem holistically, to try and focus on bringing in education specialists, bringing in the private sector, and to focus on that aspect of local support and integration. I think the fact that it happened was positive. You can argue that the results have been limited so far. It's only been a couple of years. We do hope that more comes of that. The reason that the Global Compact was non-binding and voluntary was precisely because there was no appetite from states to reopen the Refugee Convention, to go into a more binding set of rules. And that's the fundamental problem. The fact is that, you know, if you like, the refugee situation is competing with other priorities. At the moment, we've got COVID, we've got the economic downturn, we've got climate. And so it really isn't the #1 issue on the global agenda right now. If we go back to 2015, I think it probably was, when we had the height of the exodus of Syrians, and that really brought home the global displacement problem. There was a lot of media coverage, there was a big increase in funding. Now that's started to slip away, and I think it's slipping down the agenda, and that is a real problem. As you mentioned, I think a final point from me would be on the convention. It is the 70th anniversary this year of the convention, which for us is still a hugely important document. And I think what we say about that is, you know, while it could potentially be strengthened, let's not necessarily open it up if it's going to become a weaker document as a result. In a sense, you have to be careful what you wish for. So, you know, we still think it's an extremely important document. It's far from perfect, but it's the best that we have at the moment, and it's important to protect that going forward. I will end my remarks there, Kalista. Thank you, and of course, happy to engage in the questions later on.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think you raised a couple of really pertinent points that I hope to discuss with the rest of the panelists later. So can we have Guali speaking next?
Thank you, and thanks to Allan and Matthew for sharing their perspectives and informative conversations. These statistics and numbers we talk about, these are individuals like myself. So I will briefly share kind of my story in trying to link you to the failures of the global kind of response to asylum seekers and refugees, and how we need to do better. So I left Afghanistan at the age of 12 because of the conflict and war. As Matthew mentioned, that's been happening for the last 40 years. I usually say, Afghan used to be the largest refugee population in the world until the Syrian conflict, which is true, but also sometimes we forget that the Palestinians actually been refugees for the last 70 plus years, and they're the largest refugee population in the world, and sometimes they're not even included in these statistics and numbers, which is quite unfortunate. I'm not sure if they're included in the 80 million displaced people, but maybe Matthew can tell us later on. Yeah, I was forced to flee because of the conflict between the Taliban and the US-led invasion, where about 50 countries came to Afghanistan. My home in my country became a war zone. And so when people live there, they live with extraordinary situations. I have left alongside my brother. He was a year or two older than me. We were handed over to smugglers and traffickers by my family, paid a lot of money to them to take us to Europe for our safety. It was not something that I wanted to do, but I was a child and I understood the implication of war and how we were involved. And somehow we had to join and become fighters and take revenge for our family members who were killed by the US forces. It was a complicated situation. But anyhow, particularly my mother and my grandmother decided to send me and my brother away. I mean, she saved us, but she also lost us. Me and my brother sadly was separated by the smugglers. So I had to travel on my own across 12,000 miles or so, 10 countries, in the hands of smugglers and traffickers who are, most of them are pretty heartless people. And I feel like they exist because states and governments, particularly in Europe, has allowed it to exist because there is lack of safe and legal routes to safety and protection. The resettlement programs that most countries have, it's a very small percentage of the world's refugee population. And so anyhow, I travel across, from Iran from Pakistan to Iran, from Iran to Turkey, and then from Turkey to Bulgaria. I used transport that I never used before, and I was hidden in the train compartment. I had to go through, hiding from the police and authorities with my fellow refugees. The smugglers sometimes, or most of the time, would treat us as a commodity, not as a human being. They made money out of our desperations. I was arrested and imprisoned in Bulgaria after jumping from a moving train. I was deported back to Turkey. Sometime later, I was arrested again, spent 2 weeks in a Turkish prison where they were real criminals and people who were perhaps drug dealers, murderers, who knows. My crime was seeking protection and safety. And it's an unfortunate situation where states like Turkey, for example, they've been treating particularly Afghans quite badly. They've been helping and supporting the Syrians, which is good. But when it comes to, Afghanistan has been the least safe country in the world. There was a crisis group report out last year that Afghanistan consecutively has been one of the worst insecure countries in the world. But again, countries like Britain and the European Union would always say Afghanistan is safe. Recently, they've been, the Foreign Office of Britain and other European countries have been saying to its citizens not to travel to Afghanistan because it's insecure, particularly now with the fallout of the foreign forces, but actually has never stopped deportation to Afghanistan. Countries like the UK, Germany, France, Denmark, there's a lot of countries in the EU, Sweden, Norway, who has been constantly deporting Afghans. Britain used to send charter flights, and they had a lot of agreements with Afghanistan to send failed asylum seekers, which is quite immoral and wrong because it's a war zone. I wish it was safe. So yeah, I traveled across. I was arrested and deported, imprisoned back and forth between Turkey and Iran, made it to Greece on a top of actually in a boat designed for 20 to 30 people, and there were 120 of us in it. So whenever I see the crisis in the Mediterranean and people drowning and people dying, the last 5 years, over 25,000 people have lost their lives in the Aegean Sea. These are not just numbers and statistics. These are our fellow human beings, and we have failed them. The European Union have a surveillance program through Frontex and other agencies to survey the sea to see what's happening, but they will not intervene to save lives. And there has been a lot of work done to criminalize NGOs and people who are rescuing refugees. So there's a charity boats in the sea rescuing people. They've been penalized and they've been criminalized, and they want to put Italy and Malta and other external European countries, border states, wants to put people in prison for showing compassion and solidarity with refugees. So it's quite concerning. I survived a journey in a boat which was about to be capsized and sunk, and that's why I do what I do, raising awareness. And I just missed being killed. I was very fortunate and lucky to survive. And sadly, there are a lot of people who don't. And I've been seeing videos recently of the Greek Coast Guard who saved us and rescued us. If they had not came in within a few minutes, we would have lost our lives. Have actually purposely drowning people. They've been pushing people back to the sea, to the international water, to the Turkish side. And sometimes not, their boats are floating without engines. There's this tiny, small, inflammable boats. So it's just really heartbreaking to see how things got worsen in the last 13 years since I've been here. And I did not have a great time in Greece. I was arrested and imprisoned by the authorities there as well, because they deemed me and my fellow refugees as to have entered the country illegally and undocumented and so on. I continued the journey to England because I heard my brother was heading here from a smuggler in Greece. I go to Italy on top of a lorry engine, which was very dangerous. Italy was the only place which treated me with kindness and compassion and humanity, which was good. I found it kind of strange that this was possible, because throughout till Italy, it was about 9 months or so into my journey, I didn't realize that, people could be, people were kind to me in most cases. People were, I survived on the kindness of people. and their humanity, but also there was a lot of cruelty and inhumanity, especially from authorities and smugglers in some elements of the public. But Italy was a place where I was sent to a children home. I was given clothing, food, was able to take shower. So it was very abnormal for me because I've been running for my life for years, especially in Afghanistan, growing up in a war zone, running for our lives, living in fear of being killed, and then on the journey. If it wasn't for my brother, I would have certainly stayed in Italy. I continued the journey to France. I spent a terrible month in Calais. I was miserable. The jungle, it was humiliating. It was cold. That place should not exist. Sadly, there's still thousands of people stranded there trying to get to the UK for whatever reason, family reunification, language, culture, and also because they've been unwelcomed across half of Europe. We have this mentality in Britain. We think, France and Italy and other countries should take the responsibility and burden, and we don't want to take people in, even though we get a very small percentage. As Alan Matthew mentioned, over 70% of the people are displaced in their neighboring countries, are refugees in their neighboring countries. So Afghans, about 5 million Afghans are internally displaced. There's around another 5 million or so until recently were refugees in Pakistan and Iran. And the sad thing is the cycle, my grandfather was a refugee in Pakistan. My father was a refugee. He became a doctor in Peshawar. And I'm a third generation refugee. That has to stop at some point. In the conflict, in the war in Afghanistan, I think, the Western countries has a lot to do with it, Britain, America, and we've been kind of a pawn between these great powers and these global powers, and our people suffer as a result, which is why, the situation in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere in the world, we are happy to intervene and kind of militarily get involved, but we're not willing to take on these refugees. So for example, Yemen, Britain is very happy to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia goes and bomb the poorest people in the Arab world, people who are starving, and then makes life worse for them. If they come to the UK, particularly now with the new government migration plan, they will not even consider their asylum claim if they come through a safer country or they come through irregularly, which again goes against the UN Convention. Where you claim asylum, it's up to you, and it's a human right. It's not a crime. So yes, I go to the UK and I back up a refrigerator truck, which was very dangerous and risky. And it's again sad to see that we still don't have humanitarian visas. We still don't have legal and safer routes for people to come here. Britain was supposed to take 3,000 children a few years ago through the Dobbs Amendment. Lord Dobbs has campaigned for this. There were 100,000 unaccompanied minors in Europe. We were supposed to take 3,000. The government spoke about 400 and made a U-turn on it. So we are the sixth richest country in the world, and Britain has failing in its responsibility. I feel like Europe, America, and the Western states, particularly these NATO members, have been kind of contributing to wars and conflicts, but been doing very little to support either host countries. For example, Lebanon have 1 in 5 people Syrian refugees, Jordan and Turkey and even Iraq and other states who have been hosting these refugees, but they don't get the help and support they deserve. For example, Kenya has been hosting refugees from Somalia for years. It was supposed to be a temporary solution, but it has gone up. And half of these, displaced people are children. And as Alan mentioned, another half is women. And so I think solution has to be found. I think Britain needs to be leading in this responsibility. Canada and the US and other Western countries who are developed countries, who have the money and the resources to actually help and support. I go to the UK, and my experience in Britain was not very positive. It took me 2 years to convince authorities that I was an Afghan national. It took me, again, the same amount of time to convince social services and authorities that I was age 13 by the time, because the journey took me a year. So there's a system of disbelief. You're seen as a criminal, as a suspect. You're not believed. It took me 5 years to get my refugee status. So I was in a legal limbo for 5 years. They threatened to deport me a few times. And the thing that really bothers me is the international community, the Unhcr and other agencies, criticizing them, but there's been a lot of focus on returns, and countries have been forcibly returning people. I would love to go back to Afghanistan when there's peace and security, but it should be up to me. I should not be forced to go. And so there needs to be more emphasis on integration and support for English classes and employability and opportunities. I was lucky afterwards. I was able to be fostered in the UK. I had a chance to go to school. Despite English being my 5th language, I managed to do really well, got my GCSEs and exams done in 2 years, went on to college to do my A-levels, did a politics, philosophy, and economics college, then went to University of Manchester to do a politics degree. In Afghanistan, although my family was quite educated, I was a shepherd. I didn't imagine one day going to university, let alone going to a world-class institution to do a politics degree. And then, I've done things like carry the Olympic torch. I've done some really cool stuff. I never thought, writing a book, and then it's been published in 7 countries in 6 languages, using my kind of suffering and negative experiences for something positive. I really want people to be inspired and empowered to take action. We all have the capability and ability to make change. Just now, I was seeing a video today in Glasgow. in Scotland, the immigration authorities officials are going to arrest, to detain people, to deport them perhaps, and people came out to stop the van, the police, the immigration van, from moving out and taking these people. They're saying these are our neighbors. So I think we need people to make a stand. We need MPs and parliaments and governments to make humane policies where we solidarity and compassion is at heart. I understand we can't grant asylum to everyone. And the UK were always trying to be not, saying this, we're a soft touch. We're one of the hardest countries to get into. We're not a soft touch. Only a few thousand people comes here compared to, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece and Sweden. We less than 1% of our population are refugees in Britain. It's not, we need people to be informed and well-educated and aware to make decisions, because a lot of the time there's so much misinformation out there. People think everyone comes here, and that's just not true. So anyhow, I could go on and on, but I feel like we could find solution by working with people with lived experiences and taking them, not as seeing them as victims and people to be helped, but actually a lot of us have, most of my refugee friends have education, they have qualification, they're intelligent and smart people. Most of my friends have businesses. We should not welcome people because they contribute, but we should welcome them because it's the right thing to do. And we live in a world where, in Britain, in America, and in Canada, and elsewhere, if we are lucky to live in a peaceful part of the world, you should be having the flex. I don't know. You should be welcoming people. It should be more open and tolerant and accepting society. Like the situation in Australia is pretty bad, where they outsource people to small, Papua New Guinea and other countries. And same with now Denmark, and the UK is considering this idea of sending people to Rwanda, whatever. We have this idea. We see refugees and asylum seekers and migrants as a threat. Instead of welcoming them, making them part of our society and community, we want to get rid of them. And that's very problematic. In the xenophobia, the racism, the nationalism is very dangerous, particularly since Brexit in Britain and Trump in America. This rhetoric that everybody wants to blame us for their problems. We are being blamed for people's miseries, for people's conditions. So for example, in the UK, we have poverty, we have people struggling to get doctor's appointments or get jobs, and it's not the fault of refugees. There's a lack of services and resources. The government has been making cuts and having a policy of austerity. So yeah, I hope we could have an international kind of sharing of responsibility. I want Britain to be leading, but also to take its fair share, not to fold back. And how do we expect other countries to take on refugees when we are unwilling to play our part? And again, same with other countries, wealthy countries particularly, to play its fair share. And also, we should be doing everything we can to end wars and conflicts. The situation in Afghanistan is going from bad to worse, and actually sadly it's going to get even more worse because the international community, the US, it seems to be it's all about their interests. We have 150,000 Afghans killed in the last 20 years. Perhaps millions have been killed in the last 40 years since the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, and millions has been displaced. We have millions addicted to drugs. We have half of our population actually needs humanitarian support. The UNICEF and other agencies have been coming out saying about 18 million Afghans need food, basic necessity and basic things to survive. So we need to be focusing on all these humanitarian issues. And I hope moving forward after the pandemic, people could be more compassionate and kind. But it's sad to see. I should end. It's sad to see that the UK has been cutting aid to countries who depend so much on aid and support from these countries like the UK. Yes, we are struggling with the pandemic, but then the problems and struggles of refugees and displaced people has not reduced. In fact, it has increased. And we should be putting pressures on countries like Greece and others to treat people, better with humane reception condition. And we need more sharing of responsibility and burden. And thank you for listening. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Gwali, for sharing your story and for your brilliant insights as well. I think now would be a good time to play Nadia's recording. So please give me a moment to get that up on the screen.
That you've presented, and the topic, I guess, of this panel discussion is how do we ensure that the rights of refugees and in our case in Human Rights Watch in my division, we also look at the rights of migrants, of displaced people, but people are also voluntarily on the move in the context of an apathetic government. I mean, there's different layers to that question, because you have many countries that have ratified refugee conventions, international legal protections that should provide an environment and a context whereby states have committed and are duty bound to provide protections. But instead, even for those states that have ratified, important conventions and international human rights treaties, we do see the marginalization of refugee and migrant populations. I work in the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division at Human Rights Watch and focus quite a lot of my attention on countries that haven't ratified the Refugee Convention in many instances. And therefore, although they have ratified various international human rights treaties, so they are also duty bound to extend various protections, and always duty bound to respect the principle of non-refoulement. But I do work in a context where the majority of states that I'm monitoring have not openly signed up to refugee law. So just with that caveat in mind, but what I guess I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about is immigration detention and the extent to which I have spent the last year documenting some horrendous conditions of detention in a few different contexts. But principally, I spent a lot of time investigating conditions for Ethiopian migrants in Saudi Arabia. These are people who, for a variety of reasons, made the decision to travel from Ethiopia, usually a very harrowing and dangerous journey through the Gulf of Aden, through Yemen, and then into Saudi Arabia and the Gulf in order to search for job opportunities and a better life. And we investigated a situation last August. I mean, the report was in August, but we investigated, I led the investigation in April into how thousands and thousands of Ethiopian migrants who were gathering on the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia were pushed into Saudi Arabia brutally with lethal force, and then held in the most appalling conditions in Saudi, where ultimately in December we documented cases of unlawful killings, but they were beaten, they were abused, they were denied access to healthcare and enough food and water, forced to drink from the toilets. I mean, in this situation, it is difficult when you have a state such as Saudi Arabia to advocate towards. I mean, the answer to your question about how do we try and obtain protection for refugees in the face of an apathetic government. And it's not just sometimes apathetic governments, it's a government that is willingly, it seems, depriving people of basic rights and needs, especially in a context such as Saudi Arabia, where the resources are plentiful. But it is also an area where it's extremely difficult to have an inroad in terms of advocacy. So what we do is work with humanitarian agencies, states that have leverage that can put pressure on a country such as Saudi Arabia. So we do briefings with diplomats. We again also do briefings with humanitarian agencies, and we expose. At Human Rights Watch, we write extensive articles and press releases and reports that document the abuses that we hear, and that's what we did in this instance. And we had a sort of win in this case when in January 2021, so this year, we learned that Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia had come to an agreement to repatriate thousands of Ethiopian migrants that were languishing in these detention facilities. But in that situation, it's indirect advocacy in the absence of, Saudi Arabia ratifying the Refugee Convention, in the absence of a correspondence or a communication channel with that government. The tactic is to write, expose, and work through other actors. If I live here in Beirut, in Lebanon, in another context where there's, I think, 1.5 million refugees. Probably about a third of the population is either a refugee or a migrant worker. And whilst Lebanon, has to be praised for opening its borders and letting thousands of Syrian refugees cross over in the early years of the war, is now very guilty of putting in place coercive, devastating measures that are designed to undermine the refugee protection here, and is really, we would say, a tactic to push them to return to Syria. So again, you know, this is a very, I mean, every context is different, and somewhere like Lebanon has the experience of the Palestinian refugee situation, and because of that situation has decided that Lebanon should never be seen as a permanent place of refuge. But as we know, in current humanitarian contexts, displacements are more often than not protracted. So people stay, and the situation in Syria is not safe to return to. So again, what we do is document, investigate, write reports, expose, and, you know, fundamentally work here with donor agencies and states that fund, you know, refugee response to demonstrate and show exactly what the reality is for refugees here, despite the availability of a lot of humanitarian funding. But again, you know, we've seen in the context of the vaccine and access being denied to refugee populations here in Lebanon, but elsewhere in the world, and to migrant populations as well. So again, in the context of an apathetic government, we point to fundamental obligations where we can, that's international treaties, but then we, you know, ultimately always appeal to the human rights law that applies when, you know, whether or not a state has entered into a binding obligation, and that's non-refoulement. You know, for us as refugee advocates, not to return someone to a place where they fear serious harm or persecution. And then, you know, where relevant and possible, we also try to advocate in the domestic context on their domestic laws, so their, you know, non-discrimination and right to healthcare, and in the context of the vaccine and equitable access to the vaccine, that's where we've really landed on this discriminatory element, and again, the right to health. I'll stop there in case you want to ask me any questions, because I could go on.
Yeah, no.
Is that what you're looking for, or do you want a bit more?
You know, I think it's really amazing. Thank you, Nadia, for your sharing. I just wanted to build on 2 points that you mentioned earlier in your sharing about funding the refugee response. So as you said earlier, part of your work involves working with donor agencies in order to fund the refugee response in certain countries, especially maybe in countries like Lebanon, where they are struggling to provide for its own people as well. And I just wanted to build on this question because I read a recent article where Lebanon has, it was reported that Lebanon has received $8.8 billion US dollars in international assistance since 2011, and the money is used to mitigate the impact of the Syrian presence. But this does not directly ensure that the funds are channeled to maintaining the standards of living of Syrian refugees. So even though the governments may have received these funds in order to strengthen their capacity to deal with the refugee crisis, this does not translate to, an immediate uplift of their living conditions and their well-being. So how do we ensure that, resources are being channeled to where it is needed the most and channeled to helping the most vulnerable?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because here, honestly, there has been a lot of humanitarian money that has, flown in to refugee response here, and it's been, I've seen some really successful program implementation. I used to be the head of protection for the International Rescue Committee, and I've seen firsthand how that humanitarian funding has saved people's lives. So there is life-saving humanitarian aid that is needed, and it's used. At the same time, you have this concomitant challenge where the Lebanese government is pushing a strategy or a policy of returns, and they're committed to not refouling anyone. but at the same time also implement arbitrary decisions to summarily deport Syrian refugees. So it's, I mean, really what we try and do is again, provide information, shine a light on what is happening, so that donor agencies can use the leverage they have, because they also are, funding potentially capacity building programs, institution building programs with the government and authorities, to ensure that there is some conditionality over over aid. I mean, obviously there's the humanitarian imperative. Humanitarian actors, have a mandate and to respond to humanitarian need, and that's often when governments are unwilling or unable to do so. So they want to keep funding because there is a dire need, but at the same time, we need to be, we need to keep exposing exactly how the policy efforts are undermining that aid. And we at the Human Rights Watch have seen that over and over and over again. The way in which people live here. I mean, obviously, we're talking about a context which is in crisis for Lebanese as well. It's a really devastating environment. But you have over 90% of Syrian refugees now live in extreme poverty. They are barely surviving, if at all. Facing forced evictions, arbitrary checkpoints, arbitrary raids, curtailment on freedom of movement, summary deportations to Syria, and this is unacceptable in terms of protection. So we have to keep exposing how conditions inside Syria are not safe. Keep on repeating that and engaging with Lebanese authorities to demonstrate and show how. But also to influence states and donor agencies to use their leverage if humanitarian aid is available and channeled here, which is as it should be, it needs to continue. But also there needs to be a commitment on the authorities' side that they will not then push this coercive strategy at the same time. As I think I said in a recent article, it's death by 1,000 cuts here in Lebanon for Syrian refugees.
We do have a few questions from our audience in the chat. And the first one from Maddie asks, the cultural integration of migrants in the UK seems to be something people push as important, but is it something we should be aiming for? Are some of the rhetoric used by well-meaning people actually then isolating those that don't or can't assimilate as well? So I think perhaps this question will be best answered by Gulwali. Would you like to take this question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think, I have issues with assimilation. Even when I think integration is quite positive, but I even have issues with integration. I think it's more about transformation. I think Britain is quite a good example of, the multicultural society we have. So people could be themselves and practice their kind of culture and religion, but be part of the British society and British community as a whole. But certainly, I think, sometimes these rhetorics we have in these perceptions and assumptions and stereotypes we have doesn't help, even with like good meaning people. I have been to events where people say, oh, these are my refugee people, or these are refugee young people. I mean, like, I want refugees not something that defines you, it's just a legal status. People are more than that. You're a brother, you're a son, you're a husband, you're a wife, or so on, or you're an author, writer, journalist, academic, so on and so forth. So I feel like we got language matters, and we had to be using the right language. I think we need to be focusing on, yes, integration, but more about allowing people to transform themselves. And I have changed a lot in so many ways through cultural learning, through education, through my interaction with people. I don't want this to be kind of a forced process on me. I want this to be something that happens, and it actually happens with time. So yeah, definitely in the media and politician has been using a very dehumanizing language when it comes to like refugees, calling people illegals and criminals. Like the Home Office usually tweet and saying, oh, we deported failed asylum seekers alongside foreign criminals. So foreign criminals and asylum seekers are not the same thing. They're completely two different things. But usually they want to build this narrative, the culture of fear and hatred, which is really problematic. And I think, as I said earlier, since Brexit, people think they have a green light to insult and they have a mandate to be racist, which is really problematic. So I think, yeah, certainly we need to be careful with the language that we use. And I think it's just about common decency and humanity. We should be showing people, dignity and treating them the way that we want to be treated, not to bother so much about their status, legal status, and who they are. They are a human being. I mean, just now in Glasgow, I think they have managed, the people have came and protested and managed to get the 2 people detained by immigration to be released. I think, people have power, and people need to, make a stand and demonstrate and go on protest, make their voices heard. There's a lot of good people in Britain or in the world. We just need them to speak out and, do their part and make the world a better place. And I think, yeah, these small actions makes a difference. These small things have a lasting impact. I am where I am because of the kindness and support of individuals and people who believed in me, the mentoring, the befriending, and all these education opportunity and everything else I've been doing. So yeah, I think we need to give young people or refugees generally the chance and opportunity, to integrate and become part of society if they wish to, or to be who they are and still, still be successful and still do what they love. So it's yeah. Again, language is important, and we have to educate ourselves.
Yes, thank you very much, Gulwali. And I hope this also answers Moira's question about how the narrative can be changed from deserving migrant to actually viewing refugees as fellow human beings who should deserve rights as well.
Exactly. So, I mean, now the government has sadly made it even worse with their admissibility criteria, creating a 2-tier system where if you come through a regular route, which is a very small percentage of people who come through resettlement, that has to be expanded into more places, of course. But there's a selection through the Unhcr, a very small number of people. But if you come through irregular means, you come through the way I came, they will be denied asylum. They will not be considered. There'll be more delays, and that's just the idea of deserving and undeserving. It just doesn't make sense. It's just so wrong and immoral and inhumane. It's cruel. But here we are, especially with the UK and Denmark and a lot of the EU countries, they continue to have policies, more restriction, instead of making it easy for people to to become part of society and to become part of their communities and to achieve whatever they want to achieve and be productive and useful citizens.
Thank you very much, Gulwali. I wonder if Allan or Matthew, do you have anything to add to this question?
Can I just make a brief comment, Matthew? One of the strategies Canada has adopted, which we have found successful in dealing with a toxic narrative about refugees or asylum seekers. Some decades ago, we adopted a community sponsorship model for receiving refugees. So instead of the government or a bureaucrat ticking a box, allowing the person to come into Canada and then leaving them alone, what we did is government provided funding when community groups got together, 30 of them, and agreed to sponsor a family. So that community group would know the names and the backgrounds of every single refugee that came in. They would get together before the person arrived in Canada, anticipate their needs, enroll them in English language programs if necessary, make sure they had winter clothes. Many of them came from climates that were not like Canada's, and then visit them on a weekly basis, providing the kind of community support they needed to be wired into local resources and schools and hospitals. And by doing that, we overcame the alien nature of the refugee. This was someone who wasn't an abstraction, wasn't a threat or a menace. This is someone whose children you bought boots for the winter. This is someone who you took by the hand to the community hall to go to a meeting about when the farmers market was going to be open. These were real people. And Canada has found that the community sponsorship model has been very successful in that regard. We're not perfect, don't get me wrong. We have a lot of issues and a lot of problems. But that particular model has been helpful, and we're trying to export it around the world. Very briefly, Matthew, on the point of the 1951 convention, absolutely, I recognize it's a precious document of enduring value, but it's a snapshot of the post-war Western world. What we're proposing is a protocol to that refugee convention. Leave it alone. It's in concrete. It won't change, but a protocol can be negotiated among 20 or 30 like-minded countries, bring it into effect, promote it around the world. And that protocol could talk about responsibility, could talk about funding, could talk about accountability, could talk about all of the features that are missing at present. We believe there is a core group of 25 or 30 countries who'd be prepared to sign that protocol. And it could become a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom. If we put that out there, we had countries leading by example. That's the way Canada led the landmines treaty process back in the 90s. We took it out of the UN system. We created it. We got civil society and NGOs around the world. We got a core group of supportive countries, and it built like a snowball to the point where we now have over 140 signatories. So I don't suggest we tear up the convention. I suggest that we modernize it through a protocol that at first will be optional and hopefully will become more widespread. My last point, speaking to Nadia, the Refugee Convention is now widely regarded as customary international law. So whether or not a country signs it, they're bound by it. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Allan, and for introducing us to the community sponsorship model practice in Canada as well. I was wondering if Matthew had anything to say about this question in response to Allan.
Yes, thank you. Well, on community sponsorship, there is, as Allan probably knows, a small but potentially growing program in the UK, and we've looked at it and we think it's a fabulous model. You know, I've been around to meet 5 or 6 groups around the country, and really just being embedded in the community brings so much, and it helps people so quickly. They've got the network, they've got the support, and then the idea is after a couple of years, you know, they are embedded in the community and they can restart their lives properly. And everything I've seen about it, I think, is great. Unfortunately, it's very small here, and we don't actually know how many people will be coming to the UK on resettlement in the future anyway, because the government has declined to give any detail on that program, but it's certainly something we hope will grow, continue to grow. Just perhaps a quick word on the question of integration. Yes, you know, absolutely agree with almost everything that's been said. Integration requires financial support, and that's probably been lacking. It requires support for English language. It requires befriending and all of those things. I think one important thing to say is, and Gawali mentioned returns and there being a big emphasis on returns. And I think that's not UNHCR and other organizations saying return has to be the solution. That actually comes from refugees themselves. You know, we survey refugees. I mentioned I worked in Lebanon. Every year we would survey the intentions of refugees there. And the vast majority, it's probably between, from memory, something like 70 to 80% actually want to go back to Lebanon, to Syria. They don't want to stay in Lebanon, but it's not safe for them to do so, and they recognize that. So, you know, integration is an important thing to support for some refugees, but the majority, and I would say the vast majority, still want to go back, and they should eventually be able to go back, because it's important that they can rebuild their country and rebuild their lives and bring those skills back to that rebuilding effort in their own countries. A quick word on the sort of on the narrative. Yes, I think the narrative is getting more difficult. How do we counter that? It's very difficult. In the UK, we have a media that is skewed towards the right, I would say, and it's very hard to cut through with them. One of the problems is conflation of, and sometimes deliberate conflation of, refugees and asylum seekers on the one hand, and economic migrants on the other hand. And as was mentioned by Gawali, the numbers of refugees and asylum seekers is very modest in the UK compared to the number of overstaying economic migrants. And that's not even a number we know in the UK. The estimates are between something like 300,000 and 1.5 million. These are people who have overstayed visas, student visas, tourist visas, and have just disappeared into the country. And one of the problems is that a lot of MPs, particularly Conservative MPs, speak to their constituents and they mix the two up, and they think that economic migrants that they see are all asylum seekers, and they see on the media that boats are coming in across the channel, and they feel a lack of control at that, and they feel that their borders are not secure, and they feel that it's personally affecting them. How do we get around that? It's very difficult. We just have to keep trying, keep using the media, keep talking, keep educating. What I think is more positive is that there is a big groundswell of welcome among civil society. And maybe that's died down a little bit in recent years because of the economy and other situations coming to the fore. But if we go back to 2015, 16, we saw people on the streets, we saw people mobilized, we see these community sponsorship groups. There are the networks out there and people do care. The question is mobilizing that and getting that message across to the government, because the government reacts when they think that the people are mobilizing and when they see something rising up the media's agenda. So I think that's the important way to try and promote this. And just a final word to Alan's point, I can't speak sort of to UNHCR's view of a new protocol, but I think everything that you've said does make sense to me. I think the reason why the organization decided to support the Global Compact as opposed to a new protocol was because of a lack of political will. But it's certainly an interesting idea to try to take forward if you can get like-minded states to come together to talk about and commit to responsibility sharing. If we look at the example of Europe, it's a very mixed picture. We had back in 2016 a relocation scheme in Europe that was supposed to take refugees and asylum seekers primarily from Greece and Italy and relocate them around Europe. And unfortunately, yes, there were some relocations made. I think the numbers were 100, 120,000, maybe a bit more. But there really wasn't that widespread responsibility sharing. So it does, unfortunately, the burden does fall to a small number of committed states. And I think that's the political reality of the world we're in at the moment.
Thank you very much, Matthew. My next question would be chiefly directed to Allan, but Matthew and Gwali, if you have anything to add, I would really appreciate the input as well. So I would like to build on one of your proposals, Allan, and what you've shared earlier about the potential suggestion of reallocating funds to host states to assist them in meeting their responsibilities and in accommodating the larger inflows of refugees, especially in states that are struggling to provide for its own people in the first place. There was a recent report that I came across that reported that Lebanon has received up to $8.8 billion in international assistance since 2011, and the money has been used to quote unquote mitigate the impact of the Syrian presence, but this does not directly ensure that the standard of living for refugees, Syrian refugees, are maintained. And I think as what Matthew pointed out earlier, Syrian refugees have expressed the intention to return to Syria, although the conditions are not amenable for their return. So my question is, how should we enforce accountability on the part of these host governments to ensure that these funds are actually directed to improve the well-being of refugees instead of being used for other means, and to ensure that these funds are used responsibly? Thank you.
Two things, I think. First of all, until we get true responsibility sharing, the responsibility will be disproportionately borne by neighboring countries. So what the Council has recommended is we should assist those host states, like Uganda with the South Sudanese, like Colombia with the Venezuelans, like Jordan with the Syrians. In fact, Jordan provides an example of one way we can help. One of the main determinants whether a refugee's life is tolerable or not for them is whether they have the right to work. Working not only provides income, but also provides self-definition. So the right to work is important, but it's politically a hot potato, because if the Jordanese government were to say we're going to allow all the Syrian refugees to work, people would worry about the security of their own jobs and feel economically threatened. So what happened in Jordan is that the European Union negotiated trade tariff concessions. If Jordan granted 100,000 work permits to the refugees, then any product made with the labor contributed by the refugees could be exported to Europe with no or negligible tariffs. That was an incentive for Jordanian businesses to export more to Europe, to hire refugees when they had their work permits. It was a win-win all around. We have to be careful in making sure there's a gender equity with the distribution of those work permits, but the idea is sound. We've produced an opinion from an expert on global trade law saying that that can be used anywhere in the world under current WTO rules. So that's just one example of how we can provide an incentive to get refugees into the workforce, to assist host countries, to open their markets to the benefit of everyone. I mentioned debt forgiveness as well. I mentioned if the World Bank is giving money to Venezuela, and Venezuela, that man Maduro is producing all these refugees through his horrific rule, any money attributed to that country should be reallocated to Colombia to assist it with providing housing and social services for those refugees. So I think there's a number of things we can do. And by the way, we haven't mentioned this yet, but climate change is going to produce an astronomical number of refugees over the next 30 years. As the oceans flood coastal areas, as droughts and other phenomena become, forest fires and other phenomena become more common and more severe, we have to prepare ourselves for a tsunami of refugees around the world. And that's why using a 1951 document, which doesn't even talk about climate refugees, when that's going to become the new reality, just doesn't serve our purposes. So we have to redefine our terms, and we have to reaffirm our global commitment to asylum in the very near future, if we're going to prepare ourselves for what's coming down the pipe, which is a huge increase in the 80 million displaced that already exist.
Thank you, Allan. Do we have any input from Matthew or Gwali on this?
Can I add a few things? So basically, I think this idea of supporting host countries, that's good, and allowing people to work. So in the UK, we don't allow asylum seekers to work. We in fact put them in detention when they fail. So their cases are, we are one of the only countries in Europe, we have an indefinite detention policy. And yeah, so, asylum seeker has to live on £5.65 a day. Just wrong, again, inhumane. Because it's politically problematic for government to do so. But I think asylum seekers, when they work there, especially refugees, they pay taxes, they contribute to the economy. So a lot of them are skilled people and have experiences and expertise. And the point about supporting host countries. So for example, Iran and Pakistan have been hosting Afghan refugees, which is good. And we appreciate that. But Pakistan, Iran has always been using Afghan refugees as a political tool. So whenever we have issue with Iran over water or something else, they then want to deport Afghans. And also they have very few rights. So Afghans can't get education, can't own a home. They've been living there for 20, 30 years, but they don't have money rights because they're not given citizenship rights, and their refugee status are very, very restrictive. And same in Pakistan. And I think a lot of us believe in Afghanistan that Pakistan were able to actually build the nuclear weapons, the money that would pour into to help Afghan refugees since the Soviet Union invasion. They were able to do a lot of things with this money, but one thing they didn't do with it to support Afghans. And a lot of Afghans in Pakistan, they lack opportunities. They're not allowed to do jobs. There's discrimination. There's racism. And whenever we have issues over border or other issues in Pakistan, then penalize Afghan refugees and trying to send them and deport them and detain them. So yeah, they're definitely supporting host countries which have good human rights record and us treating refugees well and giving them the rights and support necessary, but not supporting countries who take advantage of refugees. And again, there are a lot of neighboring countries who just do a good job and welcoming and treating refugees with humanity and showing compassion and solidarity. That's what we need. But there are certain states, like for example, Turkey has been threatening the European Union and using the Syrian refugees as a political tool, saying, if you don't do certain things, if you don't listen to us, we will just flood Europe with refugees. We'll just allow them to come. And that's just not right. We're human beings. We're not some political football, and we shouldn't be.
Thank you, Gwali. Matthew, do you have anything to add?
I think on the question of hosts, I think it's a very important issue, and it's one that we are trying to mainstream at the moment as our other actors in this area. I mean, if you look at the big World Bank initiative recently to support refugee hosting countries, those loans need to be equally and grants distributed among refugees and refugee situations and the hosts. And if you look at a situation like Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, the money that goes in is has to be very carefully divided. If you're building a clinic, you have to make sure that there is also a clinic built for the host population, and so on. And I think that's very important in those areas where the local population is also extremely deprived. I think bringing in the private sector is something that's very important. It's something that the Global Compact tries to address. So far, the jury's out on whether that's been successful or not, but there were some interesting initiatives and funding and commitments to hire refugees as part of that. So, you know, let's see how that progresses. A certain number of corporates and foundations have shown a lot of commitment. Ikea Foundation is one that's often mentioned. In Ethiopia, they took quite an interesting approach where they actually went into a camp, Dolo Ado, and more or less implemented partly their own vision, working with UNHCR and other actors as well, but around sustainability, education, water and sanitation, that they were able to kind of implement a lot of their own ideas and their own projects. And I think that's been relatively successful, or at least it was until the recent conflict in Ethiopia. The case of Jordan, I think, was a good example. I'm not a great expert on what happened there, but from what I've read about the project, it was perhaps less than a sum of its parts. There were some issues with it in terms of gender issues, as was mentioned by Allan, and also reluctance perhaps of women to go out far from the refugee camps and work. But I think the idea is a good one, and it's certainly one that could and should be replicated, perhaps with a little more fine-tuning of how exactly it works in practice. And then finally, climate. Yes, you know, completely agree with you, Allan. It's going to be a huge issue. The only thing I would say is the fact that climate refugees, if you want to call them that, are not mentioned in the 51 Convention doesn't prevent international organizations from supporting climate displaced people. And the commitments are there. If someone is displaced by climate, they will and should receive the same levels of support that a refugee would. So the fact that they're not mentioned in the convention doesn't actually stop them being supported on the ground.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think I can say on behalf of the audience that this has been an absolutely insightful discussion on a very important and pertinent topic. So I would like to extend my most sincere thanks to all of our panelists for taking the time to share their insights on these issues. Just for our audience's sake, our next event will be What Policing Reveals About the Possibility of Development, and it will be held next Tuesday, 18th of May at 5 p.m. So we hope to see you there. And once again, a huge thank you to Allan, Matthew, and Gulwali for speaking to us about this really important issue. Please have a great day.
Thanks, Callista. Thank you. And thank you to my colleagues. All the best to you guys, eh?
Thanks.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So long,
Bye-bye.
Callista.
Bye-bye.
Bye.